Hi everyone, excited to be here with you today to talk a little bit about theory and sort of where we start with theories. We all understand theory in terms of lay theories, things that we see on a daily basis, the way we see our world. But I want us to think about as we move through the semester looking at communication theories, some of the theories, the critical theories that we'll be looking at. Obviously, every theory is going to have concepts that we're going to explore, such as when we're looking at theories like the uses and gratification, there's going to be concepts in terms of um, gratifications and people receive as such as entertainment, interaction, knowledge gain. So we're going to really look at the concepts that develop with these theories. And we're going to look at how theories have been developed. Were they inductive or were they deductive? Did they decide that they knew what the theory was from the get-go and had this assumption and tested it? Or did they start with observations and then confirm or challenge these and build the theory? So was it inductive where they used those observations, or was it deductive in that they were taking a theory and confirming it? We're also going to look at our theories in terms of what they have. Do they have utility where they can be used over and over again? Is it a utility that's not bound by time? Your book talked about the magic bullet theory, and in terms of how media would give people information, and it was sort of the magic bullet and making sure everybody understood the world the way media wanted it. Well, that was great until media changed and different communication methods came out and they started understanding people's understanding of media. And so the utility of it went away. Looking at the scope of it, how broad is it? Do they look at every angle of the theory when they're talking about the scope? And is it parsimonious? Does it take the theory and put it in a way that's understandable, that is simple, but still describes the different components and a phenomena within that theory? And then is it heuristic? Does it allow us to expand on that theory, to challenge our understandings of theory, and draw more assumptions as we continue on with research? Next, we look at our theories and try and understand them through a couple different um, understandings, basically. The first one being the ontology. What is the nature of reality and what are humans like? So when we look at theories and the assumptions that be behind theories, some of what ontology would say is that our ability to empathize with others, our ability to understand others, does their individual meaning or truth? Should we think of the human experience in terms of personalized, or should we look for truth of reality in communication? Is there a general universal rule that looks at human communication? We also may look at the theory in terms of epistemology, what we know and how we know it. Is it the individual who determines truth, or is it society that determines truth for us? What we know and how we know it. Questions arise looking at how certainly we can know what we know. Does it have to be observable? Does it have to be explicit and stated in words, or can it just be tactical and just not stated? So it looks sort of holistically at that. Or it can be an axiology. Can we separate ourselves from theory? You know, some people say that individual interests or values of the one creating the theory cannot be separated when conducting research. There's always that bias. Others say that we have to use steps to remove that bias. You know, it's important for the study when we look at ontology and epistemology, looking at the values of the world, and can the researcher really make those assumptions. And we really can't say that one theory is ontological and another is epistemological. You know, all theories have some assumptions, make some assumptions of the world, and they can't exist without these assumptions of the world. And in the same way, we can't say that a theory that seeks social change is this axiological. We really have to look at the theories in terms of the world and what we know, how we know it, all at one time. And this will come into play as we look at paradigms. One of your discussion questions this week is looking at axiology. Do you believe in axiology, and can we separate ourselves? As we look at these communication theories and we look at the understanding behind them and the utility and the scope of them, we also have to come at it in terms of what is communications and how are we looking at communications and what are some of the ideas behind communication research. There are two real perspectives. There's sort of the sender perspective and the receiver perspective. The sender is the person basically says that we send out a tactical message. We send out something that we've developed and intend for people to understand. So it's saying that we are putting messages out there with text language. The receiver perspective, on the other hand, says that we're just sort of perceiving what we see. It doesn't necessarily have to be textual. It doesn't have to be verbal. It is not necessarily a code. It can be sent unintentionally, unconsciously. So the sender perspective in terms of a campaign, we know what we're doing, but the receiver perspective may be getting a different unintentional understanding. We also look at communications in terms of whether it's that strategic or consequential, and this sort of deals with that sender receiver and the fact that are we being strategic, and is the strategic communications we are putting out a unified message. Consequential communication is sort of on the side. It just sort of happens. It's not expected. It's sort of it's a consequence of the message. If you think about the Happy Cows campaign in California, for example, its strategic message of happy cows come from California, you're going to have better milk if the cows are happy. The consequential message in communication there is what a happy cow looks like, and that if these are what happy cows are, then every other cow is unhappy. So there's sort of, as we look at communication theories, are they strategic or are they consequential? The research that we're going to look at and the theories are going to describe who is communicating. Why are they communicating? What is that drive to communicate? What was the purpose? How do they communicate? What tools, techniques do they use? And again, what is that message? What is being desired? And then what is the consequence? Is it cognitive change? Is it a schema change? Is it a recall? Is it an education knowledge gain? We're also going to sort of look at some of our theoretical underpinnings. Media research draws from a lot of things, from psychology, sociology, linguistics, education, from a bunch of different areas, and there's a couple theoretical underpinnings that I really want us to consider as we start looking at some of these communication research theories. As we look at the communication theories, there's a couple traditions that people will look at in terms of influencing and the impact of mass media and how they look at mass media influences. The first is sort of positivism, which came around in the 19th century, Comet and Durkheim. And they basically said that this paradigm says we need to be very quantitative in nature. We need to search out objectivity in all of our measurements. And our objective is to prove or disprove our hypotheses. Be very quantifiable, use surveys, experiments, statistics, and very looking at what can be observable phenomena. And they say that all human behavior can be shown by facts, or social reality is all the same for everybody. Where on the flip side, an interpretive tradition sort of developed by Max Weber, who was a German sociologist and sort of took from philosophy and the humanities, said that our attention is more observable. We're looking at the internal factors and forces that move people, looking at the subjective experience through texts, analyzing nonverbal and verbal, looking at detailed methods of getting data qualitatively, not necessarily quantitatively. This approach urges social researchers to look for meaningful social reaction through observations and discussions with people. Social reality is based on people's definitions, where positivism assumes that everyone shares that same. Like I said, interpretive says we're different. Interpretive research is going to focus on experience of individuals, and it's going to say that those vary based on what different people have experienced. They would say that combining answers to make a quantifiable thing would really just be producing nonsense in communication theories. So then beyond the positivism and interpretism, we go into the critical social science approach, which was started by Karl Marx. He basically said that it's very similar to interpretism in that we're looking at interpretive research and every person brings in their own opinion. However, Marx added that there's an underpinning of social class and social struggle and media power and power structures, and that we can't just necessarily look at citizens, we can't just research them without bringing into context this idea of the underlying structure and conditions. It sort of demystifies and describes that underlying and explains how change can be really achieved through these. It shows that, this research looks at, says it takes into meaning that people are fooled and mistaken and act against their own true best interests as defined in sort of an objective reality. It implies that the social actor must use a meaning system that is false or out of touch with objective reality, where an interpretive approach says that people create and use such systems and researchers can only describe them, not judge their value. So Marx is saying that we would in turn look at that. So that interpretive approach sort of sees the world as made up of generally meaning, with people creating and negotiating meaning, where that critical approach adopts a different position, saying it's partial agreement with positives in that the world contains material conditions on which some beliefs can be obtained. But it also says that they would differ from community to community. We also have sort of a postmodern research that we'll see, and this sort of rejects the idea of science in the social world altogether. This began in the humanities, and it sort of wants to transform social science radically. It rejects the possibility of that science. It questions whether knowledge is generalizable or accumulates over time. It rejects this modern, this assumption that beliefs arose, and the modern idea is that relies on logic and reasoning and is optimistic. Postmodernism rejects the use of that science to predict policy decisions. It opposes those who use positivist science to reinforce power. So it's very close to critical social science in the goal of demystifying sort of that social world and that social structure. It really wants to deconstruct or tear apart the surface appearance to reveal what's sort of hidden underneath. So it's related to that critical tradition that Marx described. It sort of explains and holds that research can never do more than describe things, where critical and interpretism would take it a little bit further and say that we can describe it based on things. However, a lot of these perspectives and traditions sort of are emerging into each other's, and we'll see that, that as we look at empirical studies, sociology, psychology, communications, some of them are converging to some extent. And we really see this in Katz and Leibel's quote here. Some of us are studying the text of popular culture while others are studying their effects on audiences. The former don't know anything about the audience, the latter don't know anything about the text. So when we look at it in terms of these ideals, this positivism is looking at the text and they're not looking at the audience at all. They're just taking the facts of the text and sort of popular culture and what it is. Where these critical or these interpretive are looking at the audience first and taking that into account and not necessarily looking at the text that's being produced. So I think none of these understandings really can stand alone, but they're definitely ways to think of as we start looking at these theories again. I've asked you in your discussion to look at these and see which one of these makes the most sense to you and how we should look at theories and how we should develop theories. So as we move forward, we're going to take some of these underpinnings and these understandings of theory and use them as we critically look at communications, as we go from intrapersonal to interpersonal to one-on-one to group organizational to mass media and communications throughout the semester. We're really going to look at sort of some of these paradigms and the changes in the research that have happened over the years to get us to where we are today in media. I'm looking at the Frankfurt School in terms of early on during the World War I and looking at propaganda and that sort of that magic bullet theory and what came out of that through Lazarsfeld and some of his colleagues. Then we're going to move on to sort of that American empirical school where we start looking at media having more effect and audiences having more of a role in the messages and the understanding of messages. And we're really going to look at this idea of media effect versus media use. Is the media all-powerful or is the viewer all-powerful, and how do we balance those when we're looking at agricultural issues, issues in our businesses, our organizations? How do we compare looking at some of these power struggles, and do we take, which approach do we take?